The basis of my channel has always been sharing stories about the things I love. From complicated love to difficult love to niche love, I've found a way to use this platform to tell you about the things I cherish, a way that lets me take a thing and tell you about why it means so much to me, why I appreciate it, and why I think you might too. In that vein, I don't really like talking about things I don't like. For lack of a better phrase, I don't much care to be mean to something. Believe me, I'm fully aware that the "this thing you love actually sucks" subgenre of review and critique has a pretty big market share here on YouTube, but that's not my thing, and I kind of hope it never is. With that in mind, I never really planned this to be a video to talk about something I don't like, but sometimes you go to experience a thing that you love and you realize that for no particular reason, you just don't love that thing anymore. And I never thought that would happen with Dark Souls. The idea to cover Dark Souls got solidified post my Elden Ring streams and essay, literally to the internalization of "that game was hard, I want to play something easier for a bit." And in truth, I'd had this idea for a Dark Souls video, the working title being "Dark Souls is a perfect game" for months, and everything seemed to finally be falling into place for that one. The premise of that video was that Dark Souls was not necessarily the best game ever made, or even a game you needed to play, but rather that every element of Dark Souls was exactly what it needed to be Dark Souls. Not one piece was out of place or missing. It was perfect. I would have been in high school, maybe sometime around 2012 when I first got my hands on Dark Souls, and I got pulled in pretty deep pretty quick. I was on a bit of an archery kick at the time, so even though it wasn't a very strong option, I developed a small obsession with the composite bow, and honestly, I got really good with it, especially in PvP. If you ever got jumped by some guy running a composite bow with poison arrows while dueling in the Deeproot Garden on Xbox sometime around that 2012 to 2014 timeframe, there's honestly a pretty high chance that that was me. If that person also used the Dragonslayer Greatbow as a switch, that could only have been me. No one else was playing like that, I was very weird for it. But because my love of the game was pretty PvP-centered, only beating the game once in that aforementioned timeframe, it wouldn't be until later in my life, playing through the full story again just a few years ago, where I really started to understand the game and really appreciate how in place every single element of the game was. And I still want to talk about that before I say goodbye. The world of Dark Souls is in a pretty rough spot by the time we get to it. It used to be great, and now it is not. Humanity and our gods sprang forth with the primordial first flame, and we inherited the world from the timeless stone dragons that lived there before us. It was a really peaceful transition.
Winds, mighty bolts, great firestorms, miasma of death and disease.
It was a really violent transition, but we won. But in the untold years that would come to pass, slowly that primordial first flame would start to go out. Fearing the coming dark, the Lord of the Gods Gwyn attempted to restart the blaze, and in doing so, he accidentally cursed the entire world forever. Whoops. Part of that eternal curse is the dark sign, which marks a human as undead, meaning that they will persist after death and slowly lose themselves as they go hollow, becoming meaningless empty husks of people that, nonetheless, can never move on. And as it turns out, most societies don't really enjoy having that kind of thing as a neighbor, so the undead of the world are corralled and led north to the undead asylum high in the peaks to await the end of the world. And this is where our story begins. There is a prophecy that an undead will flee that asylum and they will travel to the land of the lords to do something. We know this because it's told to us, the player, through various cutscenes, but also because it's told to us, the character, by this fella Oscar. Dark Souls has two core elements to it, the first of which is expressed here, and the second of which we'll express later. Progressing through the North Asylum tutorial, you'll eventually come to a stairwell with a rolling ball, and after the rolling ball breaks this wall, you won't be able to progress any further until you speak with Oscar. You learn your basic objectives and goals, and are given the key to access the next level of the asylum. To me, this is the game politely informing you that you need to be paying attention to the world, because as you came into this area, you might have even noticed Oscar lying prone in this cell, though you'd have no way of reaching him before the wall is shattered. It's also the game telling you that NPCs are not placed in this world by accident. If you can talk to an NPC, they'll probably be relevant and helpful in some way. In short, pay attention to the world around you. And in doing so, Oscar will tell you that his family is the keeper of that prophecy I just mentioned, and with his dying words, he'll tell us that "Thou who art undead art chosen to leave the asylum in pilgrimage to ring the Bell of Awakening and to discover the fate of the undead. But as the world grows darker, no undead have been leaving the asylum, and so Oscar decides to take matters into his own hands, traveling to the asylum himself to free the undead there. Most have already long since succumbed to the hollowing, but there's one undead who yet waits, of sound mind and body. You. That said, it's not enough to just take the key that Oscar gives you and fly the coop with your newfound freedom. The Northern Asylum hosts an asylum demon as its warden, and when it catches Oscar trying to free its prisoners, it doesn't treat him very well. Now, the whole time we've been traveling the asylum towards our freedom, we've been picking up little scraps of gear, and Oscar will give us a final bit in the form of an Estus flask full of delicious Sunny D, the consumption of which will heal an undead of their mortal wounds, which is going to be good to have because the asylum demon will probably give you some. In general, you will encounter the asylum demon twice. Once here, before collecting any gear other than the broken dagger you start with, and once later, once you are equipped with all of the tools of your starting class. The key element of this first encounter, of course, is that you're not supposed to actually try and fight the asylum demon here. You will learn this in a few different potential ways. You might hit the asylum demon once or twice and think to yourself, well, by golly, this surely can't be what this game is all about. People say they like this one, leading you to consider that there might be something that you're missing. And maybe you'll get that vibe right from the start, or maybe you'll just be a scared little guy, leading you to look for a place to escape to. There's no salvation back the way you came, but behold, a door, perfectly sized, as if it was made for you, because it was. You're supposed to notice this little door, escape the fight until you've collected some gear, and then return to the asylum demon a bit more capable. But maybe you're the persistent type. Maybe you just don't like being bested. Maybe, for some reason, you took the black firebombs as your starting gift. Well, with a combined application of stubborn pride and high explosives, you can actually kill the asylum demon in this first encounter. But the key to leave the asylum will not drop, and you will not be able to open the main door until you have met with Oscar. And to me, this means that Dark Souls wants to present itself right away, right from the earliest challenge, as a game that demands your attention. Dark Souls is not an unfair experience, but it is an experience that will punish you heavily for not paying attention to the things it tries to wordlessly teach you, or it will reward you greatly for paying attention and remembering the things you learn in doing so. The most basic example of this being that the Northern Asylum tutorial, assuming you haven't killed the Asylum demon in the first encounter, will cap itself off by leading you to this ledge, giving you a prompt on how to do a plunging attack, and then conveniently placing that Asylum demon right below you. By putting all of these pieces into action, you can do an incredible amount of damage before the fight has even begun. It all makes for a very memorable set piece, which is important because you're supposed to be remembering things here. Upon leaving the asylum in pilgrimage and arriving in Firelink Shrine, you'll meet with this crestfallen warrior who will tiredly, and with no small amount of morose, give you the rundown of the world and what the chosen undead, whoever that might be, hint hint, is supposed to do. I suppose you don't have to talk to him, you could just start wandering in whatever direction you like, but the game did just teach you that talking to NPCs is going to be a significant aspect in finding your way in this world. If we do talk to him, he tells us that from Firelink there are two paths, one above, one below. But that's actually not quite true. There's only intended to be one path below, but you can take the Master Key as a starting gift and open this gate here, allowing you to bypass the entirety of the sewers in the Gaping Dragon boss fight, which is what I always do. The only real problem with skipping those things is that I've now put them into the script, and therefore have to acquire footage so that I can represent them in the video portion of today's video essay. But that's for a later, and more importantly sober, Thane Bishop to figure out. Right now, Thane Bishop has been drinking brandy his father got him for his birthday at 1 AM while listening to the soundtracks for Haven and Outer Wilds, two of the best games ever made, which I say with confidence even though I've only played one of them. Anyways, there are two bells. One above, one below. Ring them both. What the Crestfallen Warrior means here is that the game is perfectly happy to give you incredibly clear instructions so long as you're willing to pay attention to and interact with the world. And because you literally cannot progress through the asylum until you talk with Oscar, you should have learned that talking to NPCs might sometimes be an important element in figuring out what to do. Now, maybe you're the Treebeard type and you think going south and walking downhill will be a nice, easy stroll, and oh, oops, you're dead. Yeah, the skeletons in this game have a real penchant for trying to free yours from your flesh, and unfortunately, this does kill the chosen undead. I'll give you a little hint though, it's really not worth it trying to go down to the catacombs right now anyways. But remember, Dark Souls is the type of game where if something feels unfair, it's likely you've missed something. Like a path upwards that the crestfallen warrior would have told you about, that path being full of enemies far easier to fight. Making your way through the Undead Burg won't necessarily be easy, mind the Drake, but because the open world of Dark Souls has a very linear structure to it, it won't be long until you find your way to the ramparts on high, guarded by these two archers. Now, depending on how you tackled the Burg, you'll likely approach these archers in one of two ways. Running past enemies in Dark Souls is actually going to be a far more valid strategy than you might have originally thought, especially if you're a magic user who needs to ration their casts. But even if you're not, try fighting every enemy in your path on the way to Nido through Tomb of the Giants and tell me how that goes for you. So, you might have picked up that most enemies in the Burg you can actually just jog right past, and you might be tempted to do so again with these archers. Except that means that when the Taurus demon jumps you, you'll need to dance around both him and the arrows peppering you in the back. And when you die from that, you might realize that you'll probably want to kill those archers first next time, so climb up the ladder and do so. Perhaps taking a moment to ponder how this wall is broken in just the right way that you could jump off of it, theoretically landing a plunging attack on some nasty demon boss below you. You know, like in the tutorial. This is the second part of why, to me, Dark Souls is a perfect game. The fact that it successfully and concisely teaches you the most important foundational mechanics for how to interact with the game, most important being to pay attention to the world around you, to remember what you've learned from doing so, and then give you distinct advantages for understanding that. Remember the lesson you just learned from the archers on the ramparts? I wonder if you're supposed to think about killing the firebomb giant in Sen's fortress before trying the Iron Golem boss fight. Or walking through Darkroot for the first time and recognizing that these bushes look suspiciously similar to the tops of the walking plants that have been attacking you along the path. Or how the archers from the Burg ramparts might have taught you that arrows in Dark Souls will track to where the player is moving to, but they will do so slower than the player's move speed, meaning that if you just keep walking, you won't get hit. I wonder if we might recognize that knowledge is useful somewhere else. All of that said, I don't have to do too much recognizing with Dark Souls these days. I've long since memorized the layouts of these maps and the places where enemies are going to try and take me by surprise. Which means that one of the more difficult aspects about talking about Dark Souls, or even maybe FromSoft games in general, is that I consider this style of game to be a bit of a bicycle of sorts. It doesn't really matter how much time has passed, I will always feel comfortable playing this game, meaning that I will never be able to present it in a fair, unbiased light. I have forgotten what it is like to struggle with this game. Before starting this video, I'd only rolled credits on Dark Souls 2 times, which I think is a decent number for someone primarily invested in the game for its PvP scene. And while I loved my dex builds for that PvP scene, each time I'd beaten the game, I had done so with a Black Knight cosplay, inspired long ago by the YouTuber Red Rosie and their Big Tank _uppercuts PvP compilation using the Black Knight Greatsword and Great Axe. I even learned how to parry, one of the more difficult mechanics in the game, because I saw Rosie do it, so I had to do it too. Rosie signed off of YouTube on February 9th of 2013, but their influence never really left me, so when I decided to get some footage for this video, or rather the video I thought this was going to be, I defaulted to a Black Knight cosplay. It's a pretty easy build to do, so long as you can kill this Black Knight in the Undead Parish and also get the rare drop. It's not guaranteed though, so a younger me got very good at speedrunning to this part of the game, and Dark Souls is a bicycle after all, so it didn't take very long before I had my beloved Greatsword again. That said, the full Black Knight armor set isn't really available until the final moments of the game, so this build really just grabs a very cool weapon and then whatever heavy armor set you choose. I'd played a fair bit of Dark Souls to get some footage for the Elden Ring essay a little bit ago, and to go from starting the game to placing the Lord Vessel so that I could get the shot of Siegmeyer and Firelink that I needed for that video took me around 4 hours. This time, playing through it for this video, it only took me 2. The Black Knight Greatsword is really strong, and between that and my knowledge of the game, it wasn't really a challenge at all. And so with me making such good time through the game, really getting the chance to show how well I know the structure and mechanics of Dark Souls, you might think that I was really having a blast. The only problem was, I wasn't. I was actually pretty bored. But I told myself that that kind of made sense. After all, I was playing some variant of the same build I always use in this game. Of course, the world isn't going to be so exciting, the fights won't be so tense, I know how to ride this bicycle. I long ago solved this puzzle as a teenager, so is it really so wild to imagine that I wouldn't enjoy this particular playstyle on this playthrough? Over the next 3.5 hours, I crashed my way through every required boss fight. I bested Nito in one fight, I dropped Seath in the same amount, I drained the water of New Londo and even brought a friend, although I'm not really sure that I needed to. 4 kings, more like 1 attempt. Izalith is always a bit of a toss-up for me, but both Demon's Fire Sage and Centipede were, say it with me, 1 attempt each. Only the Bed of Chaos required multiple attempts, which I think is fine. Not fun, don't get me wrong, but fine. I beat the final boss in just under 6 hours in one sitting, but I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't enjoy finishing the game, and I realized that that was because I hadn't enjoyed playing the game. And suddenly, the premise of this video didn't have anything to do with me considering Dark Souls to be a perfect game, but rather it had everything to do with trying to figure out what had gone wrong. So I linked the fire, I skipped the credits, and I immediately started the game again. The fact that I hadn't been having fun could only have been a fluke, I thought to myself. I'd been speedrunning with a build I knew down a path I had long since memorized. I had barely even spoken to Solaire, and I love Solaire and all of his jolly cooperation. Right? So this time I decided I'd try a path I'd never done, so to say, and I'd use weapons that were new to me. I took the Master Key and a tiny bit of my previous knowledge, and I rushed to Blighttown to spend an hour trying to figure out how to do the descent in reverse so that I could grab the Ayato. And then, because the sword had such good dexterity scaling, I decided that I'd also cheese Ferris and Darkroot and get the Black Bow as well. A very cool ranged weapon with some of the best dexterity scaling around. A dex build, I'd thought to myself. I'd only ever done one for PvP before, so let's dust off the old fast roll and take it for a spin all across Lordran. I didn't worry about trying to beat this playthrough so quick this time, and I approached the old puzzles with these new tools, and I even picked up some new items that I'd never even used before, like the Darkwood Grain Ring. I also spent a bunch of time playing with other people, throwing down a summoning sign outside the gargoyle fight, and just playing like I did when I was young. A huge part of the summoning bonanza was to get as much humanity as possible so that I could feed 30 to Quelana and open the shortcut to eventually save Solaire. I'd never done the Gwyn fight with Solaire before, and maybe I could find a beautiful moment in doing so. That said, it wouldn't be until I finished the Quelaag boss fight in one attempt and met with Quelana that I'd realized I had both forgotten to summon Solaire for when I did the gargoyles in my world, and that I'd also autopiloted and disregarded the sewers as usual. With so much of Solaire's quest skipped, I just kept going. I gave the 30 humanity to Quelana and just went on my way. I cheesed Ceaseless to get some bonus souls, and then I ran Sen's Fortress like I always do, and then I beat the Iron Golem first try, you know, like I do. But I could feel it, and I think you can even see it too in this fight. I wasn't present, I wasn't engaging. Despite my switch up, I wasn't having fun. And I was starting to get worried that it wasn't just the builds I was disinterested with. I got to Anor Londo, and the idea of running the church rafters and then the archers was just... I started a new save again. When I'd played Elden Ring the last time, I had done so with what could only be described as an obsessive dependency on the Lightning Spear incantation. And in Dark Souls, the Lightning Spear miracle is a pretty easy thing to grab right off the jump, so I thought, hey, if the vibe of my older playthroughs is falling short, let's just do the thing I know I liked from Elden Ring. So I rushed 15 Faith, helped 2 people with the gargoyles, and joined the Sun Bros so that I could get my beloved Lightning Spear, only to be reminded that in Dark Souls, you only get 10 casts of it. And having gone into this run with the idea that I would use it for the entire playthrough as my main damage source, getting hit with the fact that that's not how it works in this game meant that I don't think I even bothered with the gargoyles on this save. Something had happened, and to be totally honest, I still don't really know what it was. Maybe it was something to do with my Elden Ring playthrough and the much faster natural pacing of that game's mechanics. Maybe it had something to do with my love affair with Cyberpunk 2077 that I developed between this Dark Souls playthrough and the last. Maybe it had something to do with Baldur's Gate 3 and me just developing a new appreciation for a different flavor of fantasy RPG. I don't know. What I do know is that out of nowhere, for seemingly no reason, I just didn't like Dark Souls anymore. Growth is a pretty natural part of existing, I like to think. You develop as a person, you hone your abilities at things you care about, you learn the kind of people you like to keep company with, but growth can sometimes take you away from things too. And it doesn't really matter how much those things meant to you at the time they meant something to you. The part of my brain that no longer cares for Dark Souls doesn't care that this used to be my favorite game. And maybe the hardest part of that realization is that I do still think Dark Souls is a perfect game. From the way the game teaches you to play it by having you play it, how the game's premise and story is laid out bare, if perhaps a little archaic, how lovable the characters can be and how involved you get to be with their stories, and how the game constantly builds on itself. I mean, seriously, I have a bit in my notes for the original premise of this video about how I can even defend the Bed of Chaos, because even if it is objectively terrible, I can totally see what they were aiming for with its development. This isn't a joke. Think about how often the mechanics of Dark Souls builds on top of simpler versions of themselves, and then think about how Sen's Fortress and all of its catwalks and jump points lead into the Anor Londo Temple rafters and then an encounter with the Archer Run, and then how all of that says that this is a game that's going to ask you to not just be capable of maneuvering around the combat of the game, but also be capable with just the maneuvering of the game. Again, the Bed of Chaos is terrible, but I can see it, you know? A grand finale to prove you've mastered the footwork of Dark Souls. And sometimes appreciation and understanding is more than just seeing what is, it's about seeing what the artist was going for and being able to appreciate that too. But just because I can understand what Dark Souls is doesn't really seem to mean I like it anymore. At some point, without even realizing it had happened, I'd grown apart from Dark Souls. One day in the past few years, I'd woken up and just didn't care for the game anymore, but I wouldn't actually know it until I sat down to play it for this video. And I can be upset about that. I mean, I am upset about that, but that doesn't seem to be changing anything. So for no reason in particular, with no clear reasoning other than the nebulous, incalculable ways that I've grown and changed as a person, I think it's time to say goodbye to Dark Souls.